They paid me $5,000 to go through hell. Or at least they said they did. I'm still not entirely sure what happened to that money. It was the simplicity of the advertisement that got me. I remember seeing it on my phone while I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by eviction notices and job rejection emails. The text was plain, almost aggressively straightforward. Revolutionize science. Earn $5,000. Call us now. There was a number, no company name, no website, just a number. I should have recognized that as a warning sign. I should have recognized a lot of things as warning signs. But the truth is, I was desperate. I had been laid off from my job at a publishing company 3 months before, and the job market was treating me like I didn't exist. I'd applied to maybe 100 positions. The rejections came back so fast sometimes that I wondered if anyone was actually reading my resume, or if algorithms were just automatically filtering me out. My rent was 2 months overdue. I was facing an eviction notice. The second eviction notice. The thought of ending up on the street at 32 years old felt less like a possibility and more like an inevitability that I was just waiting to arrive. So I called the number. I wish I could tell you that I called because of some external force, that someone manipulated me or tricked me into it. That would be easier, I think. But the truth is I called because I wanted that money. I called because I needed it so badly that I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I called because my principles don't mean much when you're looking at homelessness. The person who answered the phone was professional, distant. They didn't give me a company name. They just said they were conducting an experiment and they were looking for participants. They wanted to know if I was interested in earning $5,000 for 3 days of work. 3 days. That sounded manageable. I'd heard of studies like that before. You sit in a lab, they monitor your vital signs, they give you some task, or they observe your behavior, and then you're done. Easy money. When I asked what the experiment entailed, the voice on the phone described something called a sensory deprivation chamber. I'd been in one before, back in college, when I was going through a phase of trying to find spiritual enlightenment through various means that would have embarrassed me. If I had anyone to be embarrassed in front of. The chamber, I remembered, was basically just a tank filled with salt water. You floated in it. They closed the lid, and you were supposed to have some profound experience. What I actually experienced was cold water and itchy skin and about 50 minutes of pure boredom. I'd paid $60 for that privilege, but this, the person explained, was not a standard chamber. This was something new, something they'd spent years developing. They wanted to know if I was healthy, if I had any history of mental illness, if I had any obligations that would prevent me from staying in the chamber for the full duration. I answered honestly. No health issues, no mental health history, no job, no family, no one who would notice if I disappeared for 3 days. I remember feeling a strange combination of pride and shame about that last answer. Pride that I was healthy enough to participate in their experiment. Shame that my life was empty enough that I could just vanish for 72 hours and no one would care. They invited me to come in for a consultation. The facility was in an office building downtown. 5 stories, pretty nondescript, the kind of building that could house anything from a law firm to an insurance company, to something much stranger. The basement was where they took me, down a narrow stairwell, past storage rooms, past mechanical equipment that hummed and vibrated. The basement room itself was enormous. It stretched the entire length of the building, and in the middle of it stood the machine. I've tried to describe it to the therapist they hooked me up with later, but I don't think I ever quite captured what it looked like. Imagine a suit of medieval armor, except instead of being made to fit a human body, it was made to fit something much larger. Imagine that armor had been dismantled and then carefully arranged across a metal table. Thousands of tubes and wires connected to this metal form. Hundreds of monitors lining the walls. Computers humming with data. Dozens of people in lab coats moving around it with purpose, checking readings, adjusting calibrations. The man who showed me around was named Dr. Monison. He had a wrinkled face, blue eyes that seemed to look through me, rather than at me, and an air of someone who'd spent most of his life in basements. He walked me through the machine's design, while I tried not to look intimidated by it. He explained how it was different from standard sensory deprivation chambers, how it controlled everything, how it fed you, how it managed the unsavory bodily functions through a system of tubes and catheters, how it numbed your entire body so you couldn't feel a thing, how it would effectively erase your senses completely, leaving only your mind. The more he talked, the more I realized how expensive this thing must be. The computers alone probably cost more than I'd make in my entire lifetime. The medical equipment, the staff, and they were offering me $5,000 to lie in it for 3 days. The math didn't add up, but I wasn't about to ask questions about it. I signed waivers, so many waivers, page after page of potential side effects, dissociation, hallucinations, depersonalization, depression, time dilation, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. The list went on. They assured me these effects were unlikely. They assured me I was healthy. They assured me I was an ideal candidate because I had no one who would come looking for me if something went wrong. They gave me several weeks to prepare. My only requirement was that I not gain or lose significant weight. Don't change my body in any meaningful way. Otherwise, I was free to do whatever I wanted. I tried to live normally during that time, though normal had become difficult to define. I applied for jobs and got rejected. I watched movies. I read books. I tried not to think about the machine waiting for me in that basement. When the day came, I was more nervous than I expected to be. Dr. Monison went over the process with me one more time. He told me I would experience some initial stress, but then I would drift into a pleasant state. He told me I'd hear a sound, bells ringing, right before the experiment ended. He told me I would emerge slowly and safely. He played the bell sound for me. It was almost musical, almost gentle. Then he asked me to take my clothes off and lie down inside the machine. I remember the feel of the rubber against my bare skin. It was warm, which I wasn't expecting. I'd assumed it would be cold, but it had been calibrated to human body temperature, so it felt almost like sinking into a second skin. The scientists attached monitors to my chest, my temples, my limbs. Each one was a small prick. An IV here, a catheter there, a respirator going over my nose and mouth. Each violation was small enough that I could convince myself it wasn't that bad. Just one more thing. Just one more tube. Just one more needle. And then I felt the helmet closing, the sides of the machine coming together. Darkness. Complete and absolute darkness. No light at all. Not even a hint of light from somewhere. Just black. My breathing became shallow. I could feel my heart rate increasing. I tried to control it, but panicking was making it worse. The respirator held my tongue in place, preventing me from screaming. Or maybe I wasn't trying to scream. Maybe I was already past that point. Maybe I was already numb enough that the fear felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I heard Dr. Monnison's voice. It seemed to come from inside my head, which made sense because the helmet had a speaker in it. Your vitals indicate you're experiencing some anxiety. This is normal. Please relax. The process will become quite pleasant in a moment. I did not feel pleasant. The numbness was spreading through my body now. I tried to move my fingers and they wouldn't respond. I tried to clench my fists, and there was nothing there. I was still aware of my paralysis, but unable to do anything about it. A timer appeared on a screen above me. I could still see barely. The numbers ticked down, 0:30, until deprivation begins. 30 seconds. I had 30 seconds left before the darkness became complete. Before they closed the final part of the helmet, and I was sealed in. I wanted to beg them to stop. I wanted to tell them I'd changed my mind, that I didn't want the money badly enough for this. But I couldn't speak. The respirator wouldn't let me. Dr. Monnison was leaning over me. I could see his face in the light. He was waving at me, saying something. I couldn't hear him, the timer continued. 15 seconds. My mouth was dry, despite the respirator. My chest felt tight. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, to fight, to do something. But I couldn't do anything. I was already imprisoned. 10 seconds. The darkness was coming. I could feel it like a living thing, waiting just beyond the edge of the helmet to swallow me whole. I closed my eyes. The helmet sealed. The darkness became absolute. If I'd still had control of my breathing, I would have hyperventilated. The panic that I'd been holding back hit me all at once. I was sealed in a box. I couldn't move. I couldn't see. I couldn't feel anything except the knowledge that I was trapped. But gradually, over what might have been minutes or might have been hours, the panic started to fade. The numbness was complete now. I couldn't feel my body at all. I was just a consciousness floating in darkness, a mind without a body, awareness with nothing to be aware of. Time became strange. I tried to count seconds to keep track of how long I'd been in there, but the numbers started to feel meaningless. Was I counting accurately, or was my brain just making up numbers? There was no way to verify, no external reference point, just me and the darkness and the endless seconds that might or might not be passing. I started to think about my life, my failures, the jobs I didn't get, the friends I'd let drift away because I was too introverted to maintain relationships, the way I'd become so isolated that fearing for 3 days didn't matter to anyone. I felt the weight of that loneliness pressing down on me, which was strange because I couldn't feel anything else. The numbness should have prevented it. But the mental weight was real. The sadness was real. I felt lonely. And then I laughed at that thought. Of course I felt lonely. I was the most alone person in the world right now. Completely isolated. Completely cut off from everything and everyone. I was more alone than a person could possibly be. After a while, and I have no idea how long a while was, I started to imagine things, visual hallucinations. I saw myself floating through space, my body drifting stars and planets, the sun warming my skin, the cold of frozen planets numbing me, except I couldn't feel any of it. I had to remind myself that I was imagining the sensations, that my body was numb, that I was still in the machine, that none of what I was seeing was real, but it felt real. The longer I was in the darkness, the more I started to doubt whether I was actually in the machine at all. What if I was dead? What if something had gone wrong, and I'd died, and this was what death was like? Just endless darkness and the knowledge of your own existence, with nothing to prove that existence was real except your own thoughts. I think, therefore I am. That phrase appeared in my head from nowhere. Some philosophy I'd learned in college and forgotten about until this moment, but it was true. I was thinking, which meant I was alive, probably. The hallucinations got more intense. I wasn't just floating through space anymore. I was floating through a void. Absolutely nothing around me, just me and the darkness. And the cold. The cold started to spread through my imaginary body. My skin turned blue. It hardened. It cracked. Pieces of me started to break off and float away into the darkness, and it hurt. Even though I was numb, even though I couldn't feel physical pain, I could feel the agony of my body falling apart. I was screaming. I don't know if it was an internal scream or if I was actually making noise. The respirator was controlling my breathing, so I couldn't scream out loud. But mentally, I was screaming. Then I was bodiless, a pure consciousness, floating in absolute nothingness, dying slowly, or maybe already dead. How long had I been in the machine? I'd counted to 1,000 minutes at some point. That was over 16 hours, but I felt like I'd been in here for days, a week, a month, a year. Time had stopped having meaning, and then I felt something. A small sensation in my big toe, just the tiniest hint of feeling, like pins and needles, like my foot was waking up from sleep. The numbing agent must have worn off just slightly, or it had never fully worked in that one small spot. It was the best thing I'd ever felt. I moved my toe, just barely. The movement was restricted, but it was movement. And then I felt the sharp prick of something, an IV needle. It must have come loose or gotten dislodged somehow. I had a plan forming in my head. If I could feel my toe, maybe I could feel other things. Maybe I could do something. Maybe I could escape. The IV needle was right there. I could scrape my toe against it. I could cut myself. They'd have to open the machine if I was bleeding. It was a risk. They might just let me bleed out, but it was better than staying in here. I scraped my toe against the needle. It stung. The sharp pain was almost beautiful. Because pain meant I was alive. Pain meant I could still feel something. I knew what I was doing would force their hand. They'd have to let me out of the machine. They'd have to open it up. And then I heard Dr. Monison's voice. It seems you've managed to injure yourself. We're going to pause the experiment and correct the error. Stand by. The machine opened. Light flooded in. It was blinding. I tried to close my eyes, but they'd forgotten how. Sounds rushed in, voices, the beeping of machines, the electronic whir of equipment, the sound of my own breathing, which I'd forgotten I was doing. They pulled the needles out of me. It felt incredible. Each removal was like being born again. They bandaged my toe. They helped me out of the machine. My body didn't work. The numbness was still there, but it was wearing off slowly, being replaced by a dull ache in every joint. They wrapped me in a gown and put me in a wheelchair. They wheeled me somewhere. A small room. They kept asking me questions. What did it feel like? What did I see? How long did I think I was in there? I told them the truth. I told them about floating through space, about my body disintegrating, about the void, about the incredible loneliness. They told me I'd been in the machine for exactly 3 days, only 3 days. It felt like more, so much more. But as the drugs left my system and I regained feeling in my body, something occurred to me. There was no bandage on my toe when I really looked at it. There was no sign that I'd injured myself at all. My big toe was fine, perfect, unblemished. It hadn't been real. None of it had been real. The escape, the pain, the cutting myself, all of it had been a hallucination, but it had felt real. They were very accommodating after that. They gave me a comfortable place to rest. They offered me water and food. They told me I was free to leave. They even connected me with a therapist, which seemed oddly generous for people who'd locked me in a sensory deprivation chamber. The therapist prescribed antidepressants. They helped me find a new job. My rent got paid. My life started to improve. It was like all my dreams had come true. But no matter what the therapist says, no matter how many pills I take, I can't get that machine out of my head. I can't stop thinking about it. And I can't stop wondering about something that the therapist refuses to address directly. What if I never actually left? What if this, my life right now, my job, my therapist, everything is just another hallucination? What if I'm still in the machine? What if I've been in the machine the whole time, and my brain has been constructing an entire life to cope with the isolation? The therapist says that's not real. She says that's the trauma talking. That my brain is trying to convince me that something happened that didn't. But I can't shake the feeling. I can't stop wondering if every moment of my current life is just my mind filling in the blanks while my body lies motionless in that machine. Sometimes I close my eyes and I'm terrified to open them. What if I open my eyes and see only darkness? What if I find myself still floating in that void, still alone, still slowly dying inside that metal exoskeleton? How would I know the difference? How would I ever know if I was real or just a figment of a dying brain's last desperate attempt to make sense of its own existence? The bells rang once. I remember that. Dr. Monison said it meant 3 days were up. But what if there's no limit? What if he was lying? What if I'm still in here? And this entire life, the job, the therapist, the medicine, all of it is just my brain's way of convincing me that I'm okay. I've been out of the machine for what I'm being told is 3 weeks now. I've been back in my apartment. I've been back at work. Everything feels normal except for this nagging doubt that nothing is real, that I'm still in the darkness, still alone, still slowly losing my mind to the isolation. And I realized something today that I haven't told my therapist. I realized that I can't prove not still in the machine. There's no way to prove it. My memories of this life could all be constructed. My therapist could be a hallucination. My job could be imaginary. My apartment could be a fantasy my brain is creating to keep me sane while my body deteriorates inside that metal chamber. I can't feel a thing. Not really. And that's the scariest part. Because numbness is still numbness, whether it's chemical or whether it's psychological. The feeling of being disconnected from my body. The feeling of floating. The feeling that none of this is real. The only thing I have is the thought that I'm still thinking. And maybe that's enough to convince me that I'm alive. But maybe it's not. I need to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know what you think, because I'm not sure anymore. If you were in the machine, if you were trapped in that sensory deprivation chamber, and your brain started creating an entire life to cope with the isolation, how would you ever know you'd escaped? How would you prove to yourself that any of this was real? When I was a kid, my dad kept a second family in our basement. I'm 34 years old now, and I still don't know what to call them. Growing up, I thought everyone had a second family in their basement. Looking back at that now, I realize how completely absurd that sounds. But when you're 5 years old and something is all you've ever known, you don't question it. You don't compare your house to other houses. You just accept what you see as normal and move on. I remember the rhythm of it. Every night after dinner, my dad would fold the leftover food in foil. The sound of the foil crinkling was so normal to me that I barely registered it anymore. He'd stand up from the table without saying anything. No announcement, no explanation. Just the quiet scrape of his chair against the kitchen tile, and then his footsteps moving toward the basement door. I'd listen from my room, really listen, holding my breath so I could hear it. As he'd lumber down those creaking wooden steps, the old house would settle and groan under his weight. And then, muffled through the basement ceiling and walls, I'd hear voices, a greeting. His greeting to them every morning was the same thing in reverse. Before work, he'd make that trip downstairs again, to see them off, to say goodbye to his second family before he left to go to work at his job that supported his first family upstairs. Christmas was weird because of them. Not in a way that stood out to me at the time, but in retrospect, it was very weird. My dad would disappear upstairs to his room or the garage, and he'd come back down, dressed like Santa. A full costume, red suit, white fur, the whole thing. And he'd carry a huge sack of brightly wrapped presents. I remember watching him lumber toward the basement door with that sack over his shoulder. And it didn't strike me as strange. It just seemed like that's what dads did. That's what my dad did. I had no frame of reference for anything different. My mom was the opposite of my dad in almost every way. Where he was quiet and methodical, she was frenetic, hyperactive. She was always moving, pacing the kitchen, scrubbing at the sink, stirring something on the stove, rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging. There was always a cigarette between her fingers, yellowing fingers from years of nicotine. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tired. She moved like she was trying to outrun something. Like if she just kept moving fast enough, whatever it was wouldn't catch up to her. I was 5 when I finally put words to the question that had been sitting in my chest for years. We were in the kitchen. Mom was at the sink, washing dishes, moving with that jerky, restless energy she always had. I was sitting at the table, coloring in a picture book, and I just asked it without thinking too much about it. The way kids do when they haven't learned that some questions aren't supposed to be asked. "Mommy, why can't I play with the people in the basement?" I remember the moment exactly. I remember what she was doing when the words came out of my mouth. I remember what she did when she heard them. She stopped. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother become completely still. Her hands froze in the soapy water. The dish she'd been holding just hung there. Even the cigarette dangling from her lips seemed to freeze mid-smoke. The silence stretched on for so long that I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. Then she rushed. Everything about her speeded up, like someone had hit fast forward on her life. "We don't talk about them," she said. The words came out clipped and sharp. She took a long drag on the cigarette and blew the smoke out the window that overlooked the backyard. A yard where I played alone because I didn't have any siblings. A yard where I sometimes wondered if maybe the kids in the basement could see me through the basement windows. She leaned down to my level. Her eyes were right in front of mine, bloodshot, scared. Her hands were wet from the dishwater, and they trembled just slightly. "You don't need to play with the kids," she said quietly, "but the kids need Daddy." She paused. There was something in that pause that I felt even then, even as a 5-year-old, something heavy and wrong that had weight to it. "Daddy needs them too," she whispered. That night, I heard her shrieking at my dad in their bedroom. They didn't know I was awake. They didn't realize I could hear them through the thin walls. My mom's voice was raw, almost animal. She was asking him why he'd let me know, why he hadn't been more careful, why he'd let me see. My dad's voice was quieter, but I could hear the anger underneath it. He said something about it being too late now, and what did she want him to do? He said we had to manage it. After that night, everything changed. My dad was more careful. He didn't leave the foil-wrapped plates sitting on the counter anymore. He'd wait until after I was in bed to prepare the food. He stopped visiting them in the mornings. I'd wake up and hear him leaving for work, and he'd kiss me on the top of my head and ruffle my hair like always. But there was something different in his touch, something strained. My mom got worse, more jittery, more cigarettes. She wouldn't look at my dad anymore. When he tried to touch her, just put his hand on her shoulder while she was cooking, or brush past her in the hallway, she'd flinch. She'd move away. The distance between them grew until they were basically living in different rooms of the same house. And I felt guilty. I was 6 years old, and I felt like I'd destroyed my family by asking that one question. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I just stopped thinking about the basement, maybe everything would go back to normal. Maybe my parents would remember how to be around each other. Maybe my dad would stop looking at me like I was a problem he needed to solve. But I was curious. That was the thing that Mom probably hadn't anticipated. By telling me not to ask about them, by shutting down the conversation so firmly, she'd actually made me more curious. She'd confirmed that the basement wasn't just a normal part of the house. There were secrets down there. There were kids down there. Kids my age. Maybe I needed to know who they were and why they had to stay locked away. By the time I was 7, I'd figured out the conditions I needed to investigate. I had to be home from school. My dad had to still be at work, and my mom had to be occupied enough that she wouldn't notice me. Those 3 things rarely aligned, but I was patient. I waited. When the day finally came, I remember the exact moment I decided to do it. I came home from school, and my dad's car wasn't in the garage. My mom was moving around the house like a hummingbird on speed, cleaning things that were already clean, organizing things that were already organized. I watched her for a few minutes, and then she just crashed. Like someone had flipped a switch, she sat down on the couch heavily and her eyes closed. I took off my shoes so I wouldn't make noise on the hardwood floors. In my socks, I crept down the hallway toward the basement door. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The basement door was at the end of the hallway, just past the living room. It was locked now. They'd added a lock after that night when I'd asked the question. A sturdy deadbolt that my parents kept the key for. But the door was just a door. It had a small gap at the bottom where you could see light from the basement. It had a keyhole you could look through if you wanted to, and most importantly, it was hollow enough that sound could travel through it. I stood in front of that door for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute. My mouth felt like sandpaper. My legs were shaking slightly, and then I did it. I knocked. It was quiet. I was terrified of waking my mom, so I kept it soft. Just a gentle rap of my knuckles against the wood, but it was a knock. It was a statement. It was me saying, "I know you're in there. I want to know who you are." The response was immediate. A knock came back from the other side, not loud, but distinct, and the speed of it. Like someone had been waiting for that moment, like they'd been listening for it. I froze. My body went rigid, but I didn't have time to overthink it. I didn't know how long I had before my mom woke up. I leaned close to the door and whispered, "Hi." For a second, nothing, and then a small voice came back through the wood. "Hi." It was a girl. Her voice was soft, tentative, like she was testing out words she wasn't sure she was allowed to use. "I'm Ricky," I whispered. "What's your name?" Another pause. This one felt longer. "Leela. My brother's Isaac, but he doesn't talk so good. But he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready." My eyes widened. There was a girl and a boy, and maybe a mother based on what she'd said. There were more of them down there than I'd thought. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Just us 3 mostly," Lila said. "Daddy comes to visit sometimes, so I guess there's 4 of us then." I was about to ask another question when I heard my mom shift in the living room. The couch springs creaked. She was waking up. I whispered as fast as I could, "I have to go. I'll come back." And I ran. Down the hallway, into the playroom, grabbed my toys and scattered them around me. I was breathing hard and my hands were shaking. But I forced myself to look normal. Forced myself to breathe. By the time my mom wandered in, looking bleary and confused, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with action figures like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I knew their names now. Lila and Isaac, and a mother. 3 people living in my basement. 3 people who couldn't come out. 3 people who belonged to my father in a way that I was starting to understand was very wrong. Over the next few years, I found windows of time where I could sneak down to that door. Times when my dad was at work and my mom was asleep or absorbed in her cleaning, rituals, or staring at the television with glassy eyes. I'd knock. Lila would knock back. And through the door, we'd have whispered conversations that I'd spend hours replaying in my mind. Lila told me things. She told me she'd never been to school. She told me she didn't remember ever being outside. She told me she'd always lived in the basement for as long as she could remember. Maybe she'd been born there. She wasn't sure. She told me about Isaac, how he was little, how he had something wrong with his jaw that made it hard for him to talk. She said their mom took care of them, but she wasn't like normal moms. She was sad all the time. She cried a lot, and I told Lila things too. I told her about school, even though I hated it. I told her about the playground and riding my bike and all the things she said she wished she could do. And the more I talked about my life, the more I realized how unfair it was. How I had everything, and she had nothing. How she was stuck in a basement, and I was free, and I didn't even appreciate it. Lila and I became best friends in the way that kids do when they're each other's only option. I was lonely at school. The other kids didn't like me for reasons I couldn't articulate. There was something about me that made them keep their distance. But Lila liked me. Lila wanted to hear everything I had to say. And then I got older and the guilt started to become unbearable. I was about 9 when I stopped visiting the basement door. I didn't make a conscious decision about it. It just happened gradually. First I'd skip a day, then a week, then longer. There was this crushing weight in my chest whenever I thought about Lila, locked in that basement, while I was upstairs doing homework and watching TV and just existing freely. The guilt was so heavy that it became easier to just not think about her at all, to compartmentalize her, to lock her away in the back of my mind, the way my father had locked her in the basement. But she didn't stay locked away. I'd be in bed trying to sleep, and I'd hear things. My dad making his late-night trip downstairs, the muffled sound of voices, and sometimes I'd hear her, Lila, crying. These awful, gut-wrenching sobs that would make my stomach hurt, and I'd just lie there under my covers, warm and safe, listening to her cry and doing nothing. Sometimes I'd hear things crash, a tray hitting the ground, a plate breaking, and sometimes, worst of all, I'd hear her call my name. She'd call out for me, like she was looking for me, like maybe she thought I could help her. I never answered. I'd just lay there and hated myself and did nothing. And then she started knocking again. I was 10 years old. I was in the playroom doing science homework. Something about the water cycle, I think, when I heard it. A knock on the basement door. Not a gentle, tentative knock like the ones we used to exchange. A hard knock. Desperate. My blood went cold. It was like every nerve in my body suddenly went on high alert. I didn't answer. I just sat there, my pencil hovering over my homework, listening to her knock. She kept doing it, one knock after another. And then my dad started yelling. I heard him thunder down the stairs, and his voice came up through the floor, muffled but angry. He was telling her to stop knocking, to be quiet. He said he took care of her, took care of her little brother and her mother, and he could only do that if she stayed quiet, if she stayed in the basement. The knocking stopped, but only for a while. After that, it became a regular thing. She'd knock. Sometimes it would be soft. Sometimes it would be hard. Sometimes it seemed like she was using her body, throwing herself against the door. I started hearing bruises in those knocks. I started imagining the way her shoulder must look after slamming against solid wood over and over. My mom dealt with it by turning up the vacuum. I'd hear that noise running almost constantly now, covering up the knocking, covering up the sound of my sister, because that's what Lila was, wasn't she? My sister. My father's daughter from his first family, locked in our basement, desperately trying to be heard. My parents barely looked at each other anymore. They'd become ghosts sharing the same house. My mom had this look in her eyes, like she was slowly disappearing, and my dad would just look angry all the time. Angry at the knocking, angry at the situation, maybe angry at us. I couldn't sleep. The knocking would echo through my dreams before I even fell asleep. I'd lie awake listening to it, waiting for it. Sometimes it would go quiet for days, and I'd find myself straining my ears to hear it again, to know she was still there, still alive, still trying. I started staying away from the house as much as possible. I had one friend from school. Barely a friend, really. More like the kid nobody else wanted to hang out with either. And I'd show up at his house, unannounced. His parents would look at me like I was a problem they had to manage. They'd feed me dinner, but there was this coldness to it, like they were doing it because they had to, not because they wanted to. One day, my friend and I got into a fight. I don't even remember what it was about. Something stupid, something that didn't matter. He punched me and I punched him back, and then he said something that broke me. He said something his mom had told him about me and my family. My mom says you're a bastard, that your mom's a whore. I didn't know what those words meant. Not really. I knew they were insults. I knew they were meant to hurt, and they did hurt. They hurt so much that I went home and I looked them up in the dictionary. And when I understood what they meant, I understood something else too. I understood that maybe the reason the other kids didn't like me was because they knew something about my family. Something wrong. That night, I asked my mom the question I'd been afraid to ask. Mom, am I a bastard? I watched her lose her momentum. The perpetual motion machine that was my mother just stopped. Completely stopped. It was the most unnatural thing I'd ever seen. "Oh, honey," she said. And her voice sounded like it was breaking apart as she said it. She left the room and, from downstairs, I heard the knocking start again. Harder now, more desperate. Like Lila was coming for me. Like she was trying to get out and drag me down there with her. My mom came back a few minutes later. She had something in her hands. An old newspaper clipping. The paper was worn at the edges, like it had been held 1,000 times. She sat down next to me, and for the first time in years, I saw my mother actually present. Actually here. Not moving, not cleaning, just sitting with me. She held the clipping to her chest and she told me the truth. She told me about my dad's first family, about the wife he'd had before my mom, about how my dad had had an affair with my mom while he was still married to Lila's mother, about how they'd made me while he was still living, with his first family. About how when Lila's mother found out about the affair, about my mom and my dad and me, something inside her broke completely. She told me that Lila's mother was already struggling, already asking for help that nobody was giving her. And when she found out about my dad's betrayal, when she realized that my dad had started a second family while she was alone with 2 young kids, she stopped asking for help. She just stopped. My mom was crying now, and her tears were falling onto the newspaper clipping as she told me what happened next. She told me that Lila's mother did something horrible, something unforgivable. She hurt Lila and Isaac, and then she hurt herself. "They're gone?" I asked. I could barely get the words out. "Yes," my mom said, "they're gone. Your dad found them when he got home from work." But what? But they came back. I didn't understand what she meant at first, and then I did understand, and I wished I didn't. They came back. They came back, and they lived in the basement. And my parents fed them and took care of them, and locked them away because the guilt was so much that they couldn't do anything else. Because what else could they do? Call the police? Say that their dead children had come back as ghosts and were living in the basement? Nobody would believe that. Nobody would help. So instead, they just gave them as normal a life as possible. My dad in his confused, guilty way. My mom in her way of not being able to stop moving long enough to process the horror of it. And I had abandoned her. I had learned that Lila existed, that she was my sister, and then I had abandoned her when the guilt became too much. That night, my dad came home from work. My mom had gone back to pacing, back to cleaning, back to pretending that everything was normal, except it could never be normal again. And my dad did something I'd never seen him do. He unlocked the basement door. He opened it. Lila came out of the darkness. I flinched when I saw her face. I couldn't help it. There was a wound there that shouldn't exist. A gaping absence where her left eye should have been. Just darkness where there should have been something alive. Isaac came out behind her, and he was small like Lila had said. Little, and his jaw was wrong. There was an oozing wound there that looked infected, that looked like it had never healed properly because he was dead, and dead things don't heal. And their mother came out last. She moved like something that had forgotten how to exist. She looked at me like I was the only real thing in the room, like I was her lifeline to whatever world she'd left behind. I was scared. I was terrified, but I forced myself to be brave. I took Lila's hand, and her hand was cold, so cold, colder than anything that should still be moving. And I played with her and Isaac like I'd promised I would all those years before. I shared my toys with them. I sat with them. I loved them because they were my family, and I loved them. And I had abandoned them, and now I needed to make it right. I don't live in that house anymore. I'm an adult now, and I understand that my family is far from normal. It's horrible and dark and wrong in ways that I helped perpetuate by my silence, by my abandonment, by my guilt that was so big that I couldn't see past it to actually help anyone. But they're still my family. I still visit when I can, on birthdays, at Christmas, during summer vacation. I visit the house where my dad's second family lives in the basement, and we spend time together. My mom still hasn't stopped moving. But she looks at me sometimes with something that might be for vagueness. Or maybe it's just relief that someone still comes back to visit. That someone still treats them like they matter. Lila doesn't knock on the door anymore. She doesn't need to. She can come and go now. She and Isaac and their mother, they stay in the basement sometimes because they've been there so long that the darkness feels safer than the light. But they can leave whenever they want. And when I visit, I make sure to spend time with them. I make sure they know that I see them, that they matter, that I'm sorry for the years I spent pretending they didn't exist. When I knock on the front door of that house now, I'm not announcing myself. I'm not trying to escape anything. I'm coming home to a family that should never have existed, in circumstances that should never have happened, living in a way that's heartbreaking and wrong, and yet somehow in this broken way still love. I need to ask you something, and I genuinely don't know the answer. When I was a kid and I was struggling with the guilt of Lila's existence, when I abandoned her because I couldn't cope with the unfairness of her situation, was I responsible for what happened? Was my silence a choice, or was I just too young to understand what was really happening? Because I've spent my whole life trying to figure out if I bear some responsibility for the years she spent alone in that basement, calling out for me. I told myself I wouldn't tell this story the way a writer would. I kept promising that to myself. So I'm talking like I would to you at 2 a.m., leaning on the banister, voice low because I don't want to wake anyone. 2 years ago, Angie and I decided to buy a house. We were tired of bleeding money on rent that could have been a mortgage, tired of watching our paychecks dissolve into someone else's equity. It wasn't a buyer's market. It was exactly the opposite. But we were done. We'd been through the whole thing. The disbelief, the seething at listings that vanished under corporate offers, the quiet acceptance when we stopped getting our hopes up. You know that mix of exhaustion and stubbornness? That's what pushed us into neighborhoods we'd never considered before. We finally got one on June 1st, a 4,500 square foot colonial that smelled faintly of old wood and lemon cleaner when we first walked in. The floors looked like leather where they'd worn like they'd absorbed 100 stories. And the plaster trim on the ceilings made them feel ornate, like someone had tried to celebrate the place 40 years ago. The basement was another world, cold, damp, and unfinished, the kind of room where sound goes wrong and spiders take their time. There were odd scrawls on the walls, spirals and crude faces, drawn with something dark and clotted. The realtor waved it off and said, "Kids," like she had a soundtrack for everything to make it small. Fixing up the basement would be a value builder. Yeah, sure. The upstairs was sunshine and good decisions. The basement was a place you might leave unopened. The house sat a stone's throw from the freeway, and the neighborhood had that edge you can feel right away. Crime stats people would read and shrug at, and neighbors who called each other by nicknames at odd hours. Angie said we'd treat it as a stepping stone. We'd bank a year of mortgage, maybe 2. Hope prices didn't do anything stupid, and then we'd move again. I had objections, mostly about money. but I kept them to myself. I wanted to make it work, wanted us both to believe it could be okay. The first few weeks were a blur of boxes and takeout and meeting people. We tried to make jokes out of the weird stuff, like the popping at night, which could be fireworks or gunshots depending on your mood. We made a stupid game of it. Boom meant celebration, crack meant danger. We'd point at droppings on the sidewalk and guess human or dog. It's embarrassing to admit, but the jokes were how we stayed sane. After a few nights, you learn the difference between a celebratory bang and the sharp snap of a gun. And the droppings. There were no dogs big enough to leave those. Not that I wanted to think about how big an animal would have to be. There were a lot of people sleeping rough in the area. They didn't bother anyone. It was weird how much people pretended not to see them, like the whole block agreed to be blind. Me, I'd say hello if I could. It felt like the least you could do, human presence, even brief. One night, after a movie, I was at the sink rinsing a popcorn bowl. The kitchen window looks out over our little wooded backyard. Not much, but enough that at night the glass reflected me, and a black line where the trees were. I was staring more at my own face in the glass than the yard when a shape broke up the reflection. A dark, upright thing that didn't belong. I frowned. There had been no tree there when we moved in, only scrub and a leaning buckthorn. I stepped to the side, trying to see past my reflection. There, between the branches, a man was standing stock still. He wasn't moving. He was staring straight at me. My heart jumped, and I dropped the bowl. It shattered in the sink. The sound felt like an alarm in my head. Angie called from the living room, casual, because it was probably nothing. "You okay in there, honey?" Yeah. I kept my voice small and steady, which was a lie. I didn't want to say anything that might make her get up and look. I didn't want to put the image in her head. "I'm gonna take the trash out," she said. "Okay," and I moved toward the back door like a man making an appointment he didn't want to miss. Outside, the wind blew, and the buckthorn branches waved in a way meant to warn. I called, "Hello?" The yard answered with the rustle of leaves and the distant hiss of the freeway. I stepped into the yard, and the motion light snapped on, a harsh circle of yellow that turned a nighttime thing into a stage. "What do you want?" I tried to make my step forward sound confident, but it was the kind of confidence that means you're ready to run. He didn't answer. He just kept looking. When he moved closer, I could see him better. He was very tall. I mean, too tall to be ordinary, like he'd been stretched. He wore a heavy wool overcoat that hung to his ankles and made him look like a shadow with a shape. A pale white scar cut across his skin under the chin. He was clean-shaven, and his face was thin, as if there wasn't much meat on his bones. He stopped right in front of me and held out his fist. When he opened his hand, there was a pill in his palm. A capsule, the kind you swallow. Empty now, like someone had cleaned something out of it. "I don't have any drugs," I said before my brain even asked why. His face did not change. No plea, no hunger, no hope. His eyes were still like glass. "You want me to take it?" I said, "because people say stupid things to buy time." He didn't nod, but his expression shifted in a way I couldn't name. He opened his mouth, and I saw the stump where a tongue should be. It had been cut, not chewed, not torn, cut. He tried to form words, and there was a mouth moving, and no sound that matched. He mouthed things and then widened the whites of his eyes, so big it looked like his face was stretching. My chest tightened. I told him to leave, a whisper at first, then louder. He turned and walked into the night, and the bushes closed behind him, bending like someone taken a giant hand and pushed a path through. Saturday, I decided to ask around. I wasn't going to sit with that image in my head and let it rot there. I walked the strip mall where some of the people I'd seen hung out, but when I described the man, they all looked down and shook their heads. Same story from everyone. Heads down, an unwillingness to speak. 2 guys were working on an old car at the end of a driveway, and I figured they'd at least have gossip. This may sound crazy, I said, but do you know a tall fella in a big coat around here? They laughed at first, like I'd said something absurd. Then one leaned over and mimed height with his hand. You talking about a really big motherfucker? Black coat? Nasty scars? Yeah. I nodded. That's Tall Frank said. He's a can man. The other guy explained. He picked cans and bottles, made a living that way. The more I asked the stranger, the weirder the answers got. One of them muttered, almost like a story told to a kid to keep them in line. My mama used to say, watch your tongue or Tall Frank'll take it. They both shrugged at the part where I said he'd tried to communicate. Tall Frank don't talk to nobody. Cut his own throat so he wouldn't have to. It sounded like a rumor that had been polished and left outside for years. I left less sure than when I'd come. The neighborhood knowledge was a kind of folklore with edges that cut. The days after that, I started getting sick. It began as a headache behind my eyes and then spread into this buzzing that made it hard to focus. My chest would flutter in the middle of the night like something wanted out. My limbs ached as if I'd run all day. I told myself this was ridiculous. There's no such thing as curses. I had a medical degree in rationalization, if nothing else, but every logical argument felt like a coat you put on too early in the morning. Warm at first, then a bother as the sun came up. Angie had been working late a lot. One night I was alone, wrapped in a blanket, filling the kettle at the sink, trying to ignore the pressure behind my eyes. I saw him again. He was back in his place between the buckthorn and the fence, where the yard dug into the alley. I dropped the kettle and ran out in a fog of fear and a kind of drunk alertness where the world narrows and only one line matters. Hey, I called, voice ragged. He didn't look at me, but he pointed with the scarred angle of his neck for me to follow. I hesitated. Of course I hesitated, and then went after him because the pull of answer was stronger than reason. He walked to the alley and sat on a crumbling retaining wall. He patted beside him like some goddamn gentleman. I stood there with the blanket around me and felt ridiculous. I'm not fucking sitting, I said. He reached into his breast pocket slowly, like everything was careful. And then he drew out an envelope. He put that in his other hand and pulled out another. He extended them toward me. His arm was long, and the skin on it showed a road of scars. I took the envelopes because taking things felt like doing something definitive, like anchoring the moment to normal. Both envelopes had been opened. The first letter was on ruled paper, and the ink had bled like it'd been dunked. My eyes slid over the messy handwriting and then slowed, a small sick twist beginning in my gut. When I finished, I stood there with my mouth probably open. and the pages trembling in my hand because the letter said Angie had a lover. The other envelope was easier to read, even with the crease marks. The letterhead read Atlantic Life Insurance, and then numbers and amounts, and a policy that named me as the beneficiary for $250,000. Someone had taken out a life insurance policy on me for a lot of money in my name. My first thought, the instinct that belongs to everyone who's watched enough bad television, was that someone's trying to get me dead. Then, like a cheap magician, the truth rearranged itself and offered a second possibility. Maybe our marriage had just ended, and this was how it had announced itself. Clumsy and cruel. My brain found 1,000 ways to make it less monstrous. Then tall Frank put his arm around my shoulder. He patted me like a father would pat a child who just learned something terrible. I felt small. The envelope crinkled between my fingers. We sat a long time. Nothing useful passed between us because conversation about something that Big felt obscene there on a broken wall in an alley. The upstairs light went on, and I watched Angie appear at the window. She was twisting something in her fingers, and then she dropped it into a mug. The back door opened, and her voice drifted down. "Honey, are you out here? I made you some tea." It hit me then with a blunt, stupid clarity that maybe the homeless don't always want change. Maybe sometimes they want to save someone. After that night, everything moved slower and faster at the same time. You know what I mean? Like the parts of your life that used to run on autopilot suddenly make you check the mirrors twice, and the rest of the world keeps moving whether you take part or not. I started questioning everything. The letter made me look at Angie in a new way, which I hated. I wanted to confront her with the evidence and get the anger and the guessing over with, but I couldn't stand the idea of saying the words out loud and watching her face collapse or harden. I spent mornings looking at the opened envelope, like it was a map I'd been given to enemy territory. I made lists of things that made sense and things that did not. The policy might be real. The handwriting might be set up to shock me. Maybe someone had forged my name. Maybe Angie had a secret. Maybe tall Frank had found it in the recycling because paper is something people throw away like it isn't a person's whispering. I couldn't tell whether tall Frank was a guardian or a harbinger. My brain wanted to slot him into some category. That's what brains do. Sort, label, file away. We wanted the man with the missing tongue to be a threat so we could find the edges of the danger and survive it. It was a relief when someone else handed me a narrative, even if it was just gossip about a man who cut his own tongue out. Angie took it, oddly. She was quiet, then decisive, and for the first time in months, there was a sharpness between us I didn't understand. She handled the envelopes like a scientist handling a sample. She didn't cry. She set the policy in the middle of the kitchen table and said we needed to call the insurance company. Her hand trembled a little when she dialed, so I answered the voicemail prompts like a ghost reading instructions. "Policy number?" the recorded person asked. There was no policy number. No one could verify the story. They asked for a social and a signature, and we had none that matched the paper. It looked official, but it was a blank that didn't connect to anything. We were left with the awful knowledge that someone had gone to the trouble of making it feel real. Someone had tried to make something big enough to hurt us. I wanted to confront Angie about the letter, about the lover, about lies. I wanted to rip away whatever truth there was and make everything either painfully honest or finally unknown. But there was a soft quickness to her eyes that made me stop. She was tired in a way that made me think she'd been carrying something for a long time, like she'd been up in the attic moving boxes by herself. She hugged me and said, "We'll figure it out." That was the wrong kind of promise, the kind that asks you to trust without giving you proof. Meanwhile, tall Frank came back different. We saw him more slowly, like a season returning. He didn't ask us for anything. He kept to his patch scavenging. Once, a neighbor left a bag of clothes out, and Frank sat on the stoop and inspected every piece as if he could read a person from a sleeve. He always kept the same distance unless he wanted to cross it. A week after the letters, I woke up in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in my chest. It was brief, a flutter, but enough to make me take my pulse and count like my life depended on the number. The thought that someone had drugged me came back. The capsule he'd shown me like a trick. I started to sleep with the light on and the doors double locked. I swallowed my pride every morning and checked the windows like some petty sentinel. We started watching Angie's phone. I hated myself for it. I told myself we were protecting the marriage, but really I was protecting my fragile map of who I believed I was. I found calls to a number I didn't recognize. I played voice memos like someone checking a lie for speed. Nothing obvious. Silence can be the most terrifying thing when you're expecting it to scream. Tall Frank kept appearing at the edges of things. At the recycling bins, at the strip of land near the freeway where the city keeps its broken dreams. One evening, he sat on the wall like before, but this time he didn't wait for me to come. I was late getting home, and Angie met me at the door holding a small paper cup with coffee that had cooled. Her hands were precise, as if she'd practiced that small domesticity to keep from cracking. She told me about the day in a way that left out the shape of things. She talked about a co-worker who'd been going through a divorce, about a man who'd offered coffee, and then she said something I wasn't ready to hear. "I met someone who offered to help with stuff. He says he's worried about you." I looked at her because the sentence felt like a bridge at the end of a road. "Who?" She shrugged, and the smallness of her shoulder movement did more than it should have. "A man. I didn't get his name." We both knew exactly who that man was, Tall Frank. The more I tried to pin things down, the more they slid like oil through my fingers. I called my sister and told her about the letters and the man, and the way Angie fixed her coffee like nothing was broken. She said to get help, to hire a lawyer, to get a restraining order, as if any of those would help with a man who'd cut his tongue out. I wrote the insurance company again. I called the number on the letter which led nowhere, and I combed through my trash, my recycling, the places where someone who wants you to be afraid might hide their signatures. Angie, bless her, grew quieter, and then, on a Sunday, while rain made the street smell like fresh concrete, she told me something I wasn't prepared for. She'd been contacting a woman at work who'd lost a sibling recently. She'd been going to meetings, talking to people who'd lost someone and found themselves. She said she felt guilty about how we'd drifted. The long nights, the small, cruel silences. She said she wanted to do something about it and that someone, a man she'd met in passing, had offered resources. It wasn't love. It wasn't a lover. It was help clothed in the wrong bundle. I wanted to shove the envelope in front of her and demand the truth. Instead, I put it in a drawer because anger felt useless there, and because drawers are good at keeping things from growing. What I couldn't keep drawn away was the idea that someone had weaponized paper. Someone had wanted to shape our lives by an image of betrayal. Tall Frank had given the weapon to me, and then sat like a sentinel to watch what I'd do with it. That was the part that kept me awake. Not that there was a plan to get me killed, but that someone had thought the easiest way to change my life was to bait me with my own trust. The times I saw Tall Frank after that were quiet and small. Once he left me a single capsule on the retaining wall where we'd sat, and I almost picked it up before the memory of the first time made my hand freeze. Angie found me staring at it and laughed nervously, a little too loud. She said maybe he's just giving back what he finds. She tried to make a joke to take the edge off, and I wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. People around us started to change in tiny ways. Neighbors who'd assumed the roughness of the area began to bring out more caution. We spoke more to each other, as if conversation might be a defense. A woman 2 doors down started leaving casseroles on porches for people who seemed stretched thin. It was week after week of small mercies and of being watched by a man who could not speak. Then, one night, there was a knock on the door. I almost didn't answer. The knock was patient. 3 slow raps, like someone checking to make sure the house was still where it was. Angie came to the door first and peered through the peephole. Her face went slack, and then she opened the door. It was Tall Frank, holding a stack of envelopes neatly in both hands like they were flowers. His coat was damp from the rain, and his hair stuck to his temples. He held the mail out like he was delivering it. Angie took the envelopes and set them on the table, hands steady in a way that made me jealous for her calm. "I don't want anything from you," I said, before I could stop myself. My voice was rough, the kind of rough you get from having swallowed a lot of small humiliations. He didn't answer. He just stood there, head tilted in the way. Dogs tilt their heads. When you make a noise, they can't quite place. I couldn't help it. I walked over and opened one of the envelopes. Inside were letters, not new exactly, but notes people in the neighborhood had written about things. A neighbor asking another to keep an eye on a porch light, a child's drawing for a fireman, a little list of what someone needed from the grocery store. The handwriting was messy, the pen strokes honest. Then I found another letter folded in, the kind with clumsy loops. It was written to me. It said, "Simply, I found your policy. I didn't know what to do with it. I thought about bringing it to you. I didn't know why I brought it." It ended, awkward and plain. "I hope it helps." Angie lifted her eyes to me, and for the first time in days, there was no mystery behind them. Only something weary and maybe a little relieved. "He brought us community," she said. "You get to a point where you have to choose what you believe. You either keep building walls made of suspicion, or you let the fact that someone noticed you at all mean maybe they noticed because they cared." I am not proud of the way I wanted to weaponize those envelopes, for the way I wanted the story to be simpler and nastier. I wanted a villain with clean edges. Life seldom gives you that. I don't know what Tall Frank was. I don't know where the scar came from, or if he told the truth when folks said he'd cut his tongue out himself. I don't know why he brought those envelopes and the letters, why he chose the particular mix of cruelty and mercy that makes up most of human interaction. What I do know is that the policy that used my name was real enough to twist me up, and it took a man who stands in alleys to bring me the evidence and, in his way, to point me toward the truth. There are nights I replay the moment on the retaining wall, the smell of rain on concrete, and the wool of his coat like a memory of winter, and I still feel the hollow where my confidence used to sit. There's a part of me that still thinks I should have done more, seen more, known the signs. There's another part that is grateful for the messy human chaos that kept me alive and married. Sometimes, late, I'll go to the kitchen window and look out at the spot where he used to stand. The buckthorn has grown thicker, and when the wind blows, the branches sound like someone whispering through fingers. I think about the pill he showed me, my albuterol capsule emptied and presented like a riddle. I think about how easy it would be to be clever and narrate a horror story out of what happened, to give it monsters with tidy teeth, but the truth is uglier and softer. People do things that are both kind and sharp, and sometimes the people you think are invisible see the things you refuse to. I still have the envelope in a drawer. I keep it, not because I want to reread it, but because it's a reminder that the boundary between neighbor and stranger is paper thin. I don't know if I would do anything differently if it happened again. Maybe I'd trust my instincts sooner. Maybe I'd trust Angie more. Maybe I'd sit on the retaining wall and listen instead of trying to reach for an explanation. The last time I saw Tall Frank, he was leaving something on a stoop 2 streets over. He didn't look back when he walked away. The wet coat hugged him, and he moved like someone carrying the weight of an entire neighborhood's secrets in his pockets. I thought about stepping out and thanking him, and then I thought, no, some silences are a kind of answer. I hope that's enough. There's a moral tangle in all this that nags me. Did Angie hide something from me? Or did I shove my fears into an envelope and label it betrayal? Was Tall Frank protecting me by showing me the danger early? Or did he set the whole thing in motion because he wanted to watch us scramble? I keep turning those questions over because they don't settle into easy shapes. Was Angie right to keep the meeting she'd been attending private, or should she have told me sooner? I remember walking into that classroom like I always did. Late September light seeping through the blinds, the hiss of the radiator, the faint smell of chalk and cheap coffee from the faculty lounge. I'd just come from graduation, and the world felt oddly small, like I was one wrong turn away from not being here at all. The students shuffled in, nervous laughter, backpacks scraping, and we skimmed through urban legends that week. Campfire stuff, the kind of folklore that feels safer when you can roll your eyes at it. For the Halloween assignment, I told them, 100 to 1,000 words. Scare me. Simple prompt. I meant it as a game, something to break the semester in. I didn't expect to carry 2 of those papers in my pocket for the next decade. Jake's story was halfway through my stack. Quiet kid, sat in the back, never volunteered. The type you notice if you're looking for faces that don't try too hard. His flash fiction was first person and small, like someone handing you a folded note and asking you to keep it secret. It read like memory more than invention, dipped in the textures of an ordinary life. I set it aside with a small, impressed nod. Then I hit Kate's paper last, and the memory of reading it is strangely vivid. The sweat collecting at my temples, the click of my red pen, the way the classroom clock sounded too loud, like someone had turned everything up a notch. I put Kate's story on top of Jake's, and I thought, what the hell am I going to do? I still have photocopies of both. I don't know why I kept them. Habit, I tell myself. Maybe because teaching is part archivist, part hoarder, part collector of other people's confessions. But there's something else. Something naughty and stubborn that pulls me back to those pages when nights are bad. They connect in a way I hadn't expected, like two halves of some paper coin. I'll tell you what happened, and I'll be honest. I'm not sure where fact stops and the story starts anymore. Jake wrote small, image-heavy lines. He made his grandma reel in 3 sentences, an old wooden rocker, a window overlooking endless fields, a radio tuned always to 89.1. He wrote that the station was only static, that she listened to static like it was prayer. I remember the way he described the headphones squeezing around her ears, the skin of her hand like paper when she grabbed his wrist. Those details stayed with me. The weight of a box of chocolates left on a tiny table, the slow scrape of the chair as she rocked, her breath cold in a room that smelled faintly of mothballs and something else I couldn't name. He wrote, "Shh, listen." He made me lean in when I read it, like I was breaking a rule by staying upright. Jake's narrator did what a lot of kids do when the world goes fuzzy. He went looking for answers. He climbed into ritual or play. He describes a closet door cracked open, a radio, eyes closed, static, a distant organ, screams the dragging of chains. He wrote the one line you expect in a dare. Face away, keep your eyes closed, and if you keep them closed, a figure will appear and drag you in. In his version, the prank is pulled on him. His friend Abby yells through a walkie-talkie, "Open your eyes." He jumps, enraged and embarrassed, and then he notices the closet wide open. A bad joke. He writes that his grandma dies 2 weeks later in her sleep, and he claims he's done with the superstition. The sentences are short there, like he's trying to stop himself from thinking. Kate's piece was different. It read like a memory written in fragments, breathless, elliptical, guilty. She opened with panic and a sense that no one would believe her. She wrote, oddly, as if she were apologizing to herself. I told him I was joking about everything. It helps me sleep at night. Her sentences scraped together images. Headphones on the floor, the sound of static like a wound. She wrote about sounds from a closet. Fingernails on the wood, a voice saying, "Help me." She closed the door and walked away. And then she erased the story. Won't tell. Will never tell. My story doesn't exist. She ended with, "It's nothing but static." On paper, they looked like an exercise in perspective. 2 students playing with the same skeleton of a tale. I told myself that's what it was, an exercise in voice. That was the safe thing to think. But the way Kate read it to me later in my classroom after October, sitting across from my desk with the light catching in her hair, made me feel small in a way I didn't like. She shrugged when I asked where it came from. "Avant-garde," she said. She laughed and told me that she and Jake were collaborators, that they'd conspired to feed me a prank. She practically beamed with mischief. "We so got you, Mr. Patrick," she said, like a glass ping. Her explanation should have closed it for me. It didn't. I started looking. It was a stupid, dumb, stubborn teacher thing. If a student hands you a mystery on a photocopy, you try to solve it. I called nursing homes under the pretense of looking for an old friend. I checked obituaries, scrolled through local message boards that smelled faintly of bitter coffee and grudges. I spent evenings in the high school library skimming old newspapers. Nothing. No Grandma Rosie, no record of 89.1, no urban legend archived anywhere. When I ran out of leads, I fed on the photocopies, tracing lines with my finger like a bloodhound. The more I looked, the more the stories clenched my chest. I kept an eye on Jake and Kate after that. At first, I thought their coldness at school was part of a teenage act. Maybe they were secretly dating, or maybe they wanted attention. But they didn't speak. Not in the halls, not in my class. They sat in the same rows, but turned away from one another as if some electric charge passed between them when they did. Once I broached the subject with Jake during a story conference. He laughed, smiled uneasy, and told me again that it was a prank. He said he had no grandma in a home. He said the whole thing was fiction. He said he chose the name Abby without thinking about real people. He was polite and earnest and, in his way, a little scared, like he was practicing sincerity. Then an older colleague, a teacher who'd been in the district for 20 years, poured one look over my photocopies and said a thing that made the room drop like a soft stone. "Abby." He paused and put his coffee down. A year before I arrived, an 8th grader named Abby had disappeared. Vanished out of her bedroom, most people whispered. No sign of forced entry, no note, no satisfying explanation. The police had suspected running away, which everyone knows is code for no leads. The town did what small towns do. They folded it into rumor and grief, and then the case grew cold. The old teacher's face went white around the edges when he read Kate's lines about the closet. I went home and read the papers again, searching for anything I'd missed. In Jake's piece, Abby was the friend on the walkie-talkie, the one who yelled, the one who giggled when he jumped. In Kate's, she might be the voice in the closet, squeaking, "Help me." Neither student ever explicitly said Abby was real in class, and yet the name hung there like a bruise. Whoever these kids were playing at being, their names matched something the town had tried to forget. I told the administration. I told the police. They spoke with Jake and Kate. Teachers, officers in sensible shoes, all of them leaning in to ask the exact same questions in the exact same tones. The kids said the same thing. Fiction. An exercise. A prank. They wanted to keep the semester light and creative. Jake made an apology about using a real name. Like that could undo the coincidence. Kate kept her face blank, a tiny crease of something unreadable between her brows. The officers left with the sort of empathy reserved for parents, for people trying to do their jobs with limited facts. Then the town turned on me. I'd expected skepticism. I hadn't expected to be treated like I'd dragged 2 kids into the mud. People whispered in the grocery store aisles. Parents called the school to ask why I'd been poking around family names. I became a story. Small-town gossip does that. I left. I packed a cardboard box of my things. A half-used poster of wild quotes. A mug with dried tea at the bottom. The photocopies tucked into my shirt. I remember walking past the glass doors and seeing Kate's face at a first-floor window. She made that smirk she always did, like she'd won something. It was better than being angry. I was embarrassed and then later relieved to be removed from where the rumor gravity had been strongest. I drove away and tried to put the case in a neat shoebox of memory. That didn't work. The papers came with me. I carried the photocopies to new apartments and to bars and to cheap motel rooms during conferences, and some nights I'd read them until my eyes blurred. I started doing the thing I tell students not to do. I let story bleed into life. I closed my bedroom door so the hallway light haloed under it. I put on headphones. I found a cheap radio that would at least settle on a band, and I turned it. Not 889.1, because everyone knows low-power educational-based stations have dial noise. But something in that frequency area that could make my penultimate rationality was ridiculous. I was doing a ritual of my own, 3 decades removed from being a teenager who believed in dares. I sat with the closet ajar like Jake had written, back to the darkness, headphones in, listening for the organ, the metal on gravel, the voice in the wood. Sometimes the static seemed to breathe. Sometimes I convinced myself a distant sound might be an organ. Other nights it was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the tiny high bell of a nearby siren. One night, I got reckless. I'd been drinking slightly too much coffee and too little sleep, and the bubble of other people's stories had popped and left me raw. I tuned into a station that hissed and I closed my eyes. The room felt smaller, like the walls were rounding off, and for a second I convinced myself there was something behind me. My skin went dry, and my mouth tasted like old pennies. The closet was a sliver of dark. I heard the faintest scrape, like a fingernail on wood, and then I heard maybe imagined air moving in a way rooms don't usually hold their breath. I told myself it was a wiring noise, the building settling, my own throat. I learned the anatomy of hesitation. It's small things. The pause before you open a door, the hand hovering, a breath held like currency. When people write horror or read it in cheap anthologies, they always rush to the clap of the final scene, the scream. The real horror for me was the stretch. A week of watching 2 kids avoid each other, a month of unanswered calls, the long itch of not knowing. The physical parts followed. The chest tightening like someone had knotted a rope there. Legs that wouldn't move because your brain decides stillness is safer. A slight metallic taste that runs across the tongue when a memory edges into fear. Those were details I could trust because they were honest. They happened to me. Weeks became months. The town moved on because towns do. Kids graduated. Other missing persons turned up as stories for middle-aged cocktails at the diner. Seasons changed. I took temp work, proofreading manuals for a local printing shop, vacuuming other people's paper dust from my clothes, and sometimes in the middle of folding a ream, I'd feel a flash of absurd jealousy, of the way the kids had been able to plant a little seed of unease and make everyone scramble. It's petty, I know, but there's a kind of creative longing that can look indistinguishable from obsession. I went back once, 2 years later, for reasons I still have trouble naming. Compulsion, curiosity, guilt, call it what you will. I parked where I used to and walked the cracked sidewalks that led by cinder block storefronts and a bakery that smelled like butter. The high school looked smaller. The Faces lunchroom seemed an inch closer to being my age. I stood across from the house on the street where Abby had supposedly lived. Jake had written that name across his story so plainly. And for a long time I just watched. Houses have a posture. This one looked paused, like it was waiting for something to finish saying its name. I thought about knocking on doors. I didn't. I walked my fingers along the event notices tacked to a telephone pole instead, and then left. Maybe I was afraid of answers. Or maybe I was afraid of no answers. Both feel heavy. Years slip in their own manners. I left teaching, took a job with a small press, and learned to live with my small private curiosities. Sometimes, in hotel rooms, I dream of static. Sometimes, in honest light, the little hairs at the back of my neck rise for no good reason. And I remember the feel of headphones squeezing around an old woman's head in Jake's story, the way a closet door sounds when it's pushed. Subtle, a tiny complaint of wood. I find myself thinking about motive, about what would drive two teenagers to write something that mirrored a true absence, so closely it made adults lie awake. There are a few possible explanations. Maybe they were brilliant little storytellers, with more nerve than sense, concocting a layered prank to watch the teacher unravel. Teenagers are theatrical. Why not design a narrative that stitches itself across two voices? Or maybe they were experimenting with the boundaries of empathy, trying to make strangers feel a single, shared moment. It's possible they'd heard about Abby in passing and used the name thoughtlessly, the way you do when you live in a town with a few too many small tragedies. Sometimes names stick like lint. Then there's the other possibility that gnaws at the back of me when I can't sleep. What if it wasn't just a game? What if the stories were an act of confession, or a way to contain something that didn't fit inside words otherwise? Kate's voice, the one that ends with, "It's nothing but static," reads like someone trying to make a memory disappear by refusing to tell it. People do that. There are things we tuck away and call silence. We tell ourselves we were only joking, because a steady diet of jokes is a good anesthetic. Sometimes silence protects us, sometimes it eats us. In the years since, I've kept the photocopies folded in my wallet more out of ritual than reason. They're soft at the edges now, the ink smudged where beer once spilled on them during a bad night at a bar. I take them out sometimes to remind myself how stories can be both maps and traps. If you follow them too faithfully, you might end up where you started. Or you might find a place that should have stayed buried. When news about another missing kid flickers past my screen, I feel the old itch. I think about radios and closets and heady, stupid dares. I wonder, in private, if those rituals people invent are attempts to order things the adult world has no language for. Maybe that's why the students wrote what they did, because they were trying to name a fear that the grown-ups around them refused to look at. There's one detail I can never shake, the way Kate's story erases itself at the end. The line about not telling, about the story not existing. It reads like a promise and a threat at once. Promises and threats are close cousins in a town the size of the one I left. You promise to keep someone's secret, and then you threaten the future by holding the secret too tightly. If Abby was real, and if someone had locked her in a closet, if that image is more literal than metaphor, then the silence is monstrous. If instead it was a rumor that spiraled, then silence was the only thing that saved a name from being ground into gossip. Both versions feel rotten. I don't have an answer. I don't have justice. I have 2 photocopies and the knowledge that a teacher can be both investigator and fool. The kids are adults now. The town is older, and Abby is still a blank I can't fill. Maybe I'll go back again. Maybe I'll find something and close the loop cleanly like a good class discussion should. Or maybe I'll sit in my apartment, radio turned between stations, and convince myself I heard an organ, because that's what grief sounds like when it's dressed up as curiosity. When I tell this to friends, when I tell myself this, I usually end with the same small confession. I wanted the story to be true. Not because I wanted harm or mystery for its own sake, but because stories make sense of loss in a way the world rarely does. If it was true, if Abby's disappearance threaded directly into 2 sophomore assignments, then there's an arc, a reason, a closure of some sort, even if it's messy and 15 years late. If it's false, then that's a different kind of cruelty. A fiction made to mimic tragedy, a prank that spun a town into suspicion. Neither option sits comfortably with me. I still find myself replaying small moments. Kate's smirk at the window as I left the school. Jake's awkward smile in the conference room. The old teacher's hand hovering over a page, as if he might actually feel the name through the ink. Memory is soft and traitorous. It smooths edges until everything is ambiguous. Sometimes, late at night, I place the photocopies on my kitchen table, turn off every light, and imagine I can hear static. I imagine being that teacher again, leaning forward with a red pen, feeling a little thrill when a student hands you a mystery. But then there's the little gravity of loss. What responsibility do we carry for stories that might be real? What do we do when fiction and fact cross, like 2 trains in the dark? I'll tell you something honest and small. For a long time, I thought leaving town made me safe from that unease. Moving forward was supposed to be the cure. But the real world has a way of keeping your past at the edge of your dreams. The stories keep knocking, softly. I'm not proud of the nights I'd sit with headphones in back to the closet, hunting for a sound that might be only my own imagination. But I was trying to see which version of responsibility felt worse. Ignoring a possible cry for help, or inventing a reason for why the cry never existed. There's no satisfying moral here. That's the thing I keep returning to when I can't sleep. The moral emptiness of not knowing. I am left with 2 student papers, a town's brittle memory, and the small, persistent image of a closet door pushed just a crack open. I keep thinking about the moment when someone chose silence over speaking. The point where a decision could have helped or harmed. Do you think Kate was protecting someone by not telling the whole story? Or was her silence the thing that made the harm last longer? 8. I killed all of my colleagues, and I'll never get caught. This is my confession. My name is Sam Wilkinson. These will be my last words on Earth. I recently got a strange email at work, and before I leave for good, I would like to tell you all about that email and what it led to. I don't care if you believe me or not. I just want to leave something behind. A confession, if you will. I'll try to keep it brief, but I guess I should start from the beginning nonetheless. I hated my life for as long as I could remember. It started on the first day of school, and the bullying never stopped. I'm still trying to figure out what I did to deserve it, if anything, and even now it feels like trying to find a straight line in a hall of mirrors. They called me names, shoved me, laughed when food slipped from my hands, and every shove seemed to open a little more space between me and everyone else. I don't know when I stopped expecting kindness. Maybe I never really expected it. Maybe I only expected the next insult. I ate to fill a hole I couldn't name, and the eating made them laugh more, and the laughing made me eat more. I grew into an adult who avoided people because people hurt. That's what I kept telling myself. Except my mom. She was the one person who didn't. She looked at the photographs from when I was a baby sometimes. This soft half-smile, like someone remembering warmer weather, and I hated that she had been given the version of me that was still full of possibilities. I felt like a fraud living in that smile. I didn't learn anything useful. I learned enough to get by, to know menus and cheat codes, and the way controllers warmed from my palms. For years, I lived in my mom's basement playing old games and pretending that the glow of a CRT was a window. My shame tasted like stale snacks and the fluorescent light above the TV. I told myself I liked being secluded. That was easier than admitting I was terrified of other people. My mom pushed me, eventually, the way parents do when their own bills start to look like mountains. She signed me up for a vocational program close to home, because I didn't have a license and because she wanted me within reach. I thought it was punishment. She thought it was a rope. Business administration was the subject I picked by default. The dullest possible path. Spreadsheets, forms, rows of cells that never complained. After an internship at a big tech place, you've heard of it. Of all the impossible things, they hired me. You'd think getting a job would feel like winning the lottery. For me, it felt like stepping onto a train that only traveled through fluorescent-lit tunnels. The office was open plan, thin partitions, and too many human voices. People chose not to sit next to me on the bus. They chose empty seats like a small daily vote against me. In the office, HR sat like a small, constant storm, loud, social, and allergic to me. They pretended I didn't exist, and then, when I had to speak, they gave me those looks you get when you find something sticky on your shoe. Jennifer, who sat next to me, made sure I felt it first and most. She rolled her eyes when I sat down, the expression practiced like a habitual reflex. They discussed me behind voices that weren't careful. It felt like trying to breathe while someone pressed a palm over my mouth. Then my boss called me into her office one day and said someone had complained about my hygiene. Why don't you take a shower in the morning? As if that were a thing I could choose like a song on a playlist. I already took showers. I walked, I took buses, My anxiety turned me into a leaking faucet of sweat and panic. Hearing that crushed me. Suicidal thoughts surged with a clarity I'd never felt. The only thing that stopped me from acting on them was my mom, and the thought of what it would do to her. She was my tether. A week ago, that tether snapped. I found her on the living room floor when I came home from work. Her dressing gown was still on. She was alive but had lost the words. She gurgled and looked lost in a body that had once been all careful hands and soft eyes. I called an ambulance and spent the rest of that day watching hospital ceilings and registers and tubes. She died that night. The doctor said stroke, and then offered me a folded condolence that felt like a small, useless piece of paper. Losing her meant something in me died then too. Something that expected rescue, that expected someone to be softer than the world. The office didn't give me the day off. My boss's voice was brittle with corporate sympathy and thin with rules. Everyone at work knew what had happened. No one said anything to me. No one. I pictured taking the window on the 50th floor and ending it like that. It seemed precise and clean and final. I had made up my mind that day, sure as anything I had ever been sure of, and then the email appeared. It began, "Here's your access to the forest." A username and password followed. At the bottom it said, Garns Leaf. The name used a company email, so I assumed T. But there was no explanation, no meeting memo, nothing. I asked Jennifer about it, and she gave me the usual look, like I'd asked for a favor that involved touching something ugly. I told myself it was a mistake or some joke. It didn't feel like much then. But I remember the way my palms were a little damp when I clicked the new desktop icon later that morning. Pixelated trees where my cursor landed, innocuous and somehow hypnotic. When I opened it, the interface looked like something from the 90s. A small live stream window filled most of the space with a forest, low-res and grainy, but not synthetic. I could rotate the camera 360 degrees. Beneath the stream a bar controlled the speed of time, set to real time by default. But I could push it up to 100 years per second. 2 buttons, import and export. There was an about page that said simply, Made by Leaf. Clicking import brought up a catalog of everyone in the company. A search bar. Names flowing like a roster. I clicked away at first. I'm not proud of how quickly my curiosity turned toward mischief. I looked up and watched my boss cross the corridor. I closed the program and told myself I was done. I went home and lay where my mother had fallen and thought about windows. The forest's moon was wrong the next day, more orange than the one I've seen for years, and it cast a sandy light that made the leaves look like they were painted in sepia. I'd gotten to the office early because staying at home meant seeing the place where my mom had stopped asking questions. The program was still there, still patient. I bumped the time a little and watched clouds smear like smudges. I pressed export and import like a lab tech prodding a specimen. I searched for Jennifer because she annoyed me, and because I wanted to know what the program did. The dialog box asked plainly, "Are you sure you want to import Jennifer Norman into the forest?" And, daft as it sounds, I pressed yes. Her name vanished from the list and then sat in export, as if waiting to be sent back. She didn't show up for lunch. I ate a burger alone under a cheap light, the ceiling speakers playing "In the Year 2525," for reasons that felt cruelly apt. I thought about the window more than I thought about the program. If this was some HR prank, it was a sick one. At noon, my boss asked if anyone had seen Jennifer, and my stomach made that slow, nauseous turn. I opened the forest, exported Jennifer back out, and then watched from a cubicle as she walked in, and everyone reacted like she'd wandered in from another planet. She was wrong. Her face had a long, ugly scar, and her clothes looked like they'd been worn for years. She screamed when she saw herself in a mirror. People gathered and watched, jaws open. Her husband called in, later, stammering something about nightmares and a voice he couldn't understand. I told myself I had nothing to do with it. My rational brain lined up explanations. A prank, an elaborate costume, a mental break. But the time bar sat in my head like a little machine that had already made its imprint. I did the math. Hours per second. If she'd been there for hours on my screen, in the program she'd experienced years. Something in me tightened, and a part of me felt vindictive, and a part of me was sick with a new, awful curiosity. I started testing it. Thomas, the guy who made jokes about everything, including me, went missing from his desk. I imported him while he was standing right there. His briefcase was still on his desk, and he appeared a moment later, on the floor, disoriented, like someone waking from a faint. He said he'd blacked out. I told him that was weird, and then sat down and watched the forest like an idiot child who'd opened a forbidden window and then hidden behind the curtains to watch what it did. The feed showed things that weren't animals I knew. 2 bluish giraffes with mouths placed wrong. A slug that looked like a living cave. I felt a queer delight at first, that small satisfaction of revenge. I'd make them feel small, vulnerable. But it was uneasy and brittle. Jennifer's friend talked about her nightmares, about monsters deep in trees. I felt a small, sour triumph at the thought that her tormentors, all of them, were inside some kind of horror of my own making. I also felt very, very frightened. I had a tool, and I was starting to use it. It got worse. I found that if I sped the time up, I could watch the forest run through seasons and centuries in minutes. The trees burned and then grew back in accelerated loops. Storms rolled violet clouds that had a purple tint, like bruises across the sky. Creatures devoured each other, and sometimes entire ecosystems collapsed in a blink. The forest obeyed me like a small, indifferent god. I kept a list in my head. Names to import, names to erase from the world. The office felt smaller, like a series of threats moving closer. The day before the funeral, my curiosity shifted into an ugly momentum. If I could do this to one person, who else could I pull? I imported people at random at first, then deliberately. I tried numbers one by one, then entire swaths. I watched them on the screen. Some ran, some hid, some screamed. The stream had no sound, but you could tell grief from the way someone staggered, fear from the way someone pressed back into shadow. I started to speed time and not export. Dialogue boxes told me others were about to expire, and the prompt asked if I wanted to export. I thought sometimes then I can admit now. The program gave me a responsibility, and I refused it like a child, refusing to put the toy back together. The forest did something I didn't expect. It made cultures out of the people I put there. After a while, the survivors gathered, made fires, learned to make spears, then bows, then wheels. Generations passed in minutes on my end and centuries on theirs. I found myself watching their slow, painful adaptations with a sort of wonder I'd never allowed myself before. The cleaner, who used to be a dentist, taught someone to shape teeth with stone tools. A medical doctor I'd always thought to be soft turned up in a village teaching herbs. Watching them become a civilization, primitive and then slowly climbing, was like watching a child walk for the first time. It made me feel important in a way nothing ever had. I was the idiot at the center of a religion, a flickering god whose face they never saw. That feeling shifted into pride very quickly. I brought in 3 of the smartest people I knew and sped time. The forest responded by building villages, then towns. I watched altars form around the camera, stone rings, and then a structure that could have been Stonehenge if history had been less kind. They worshipped the camera like a relic, being worshipped by people who only existed because of my clique was a dangerous, intoxicating thing. I couldn't tell if the feeling that whispered in me was regret or hunger. I imported more. I pushed the speed and watched wars that grew like mold, watched cities burn and rebuild. At the 100 years a second setting, the program flattened life into waves of construction and destruction. Cities bloomed and collapsed in my peripheral vision, and I began to feel like a cruel but competent conductor. The janitor found me looking at it. I panicked and showed him the program because I am terrible at secrets and because I didn't know what else to do. He laughed and called me fat, the same cheap joke he always used. And then he asked to see what happened if we pressed import. I shouldn't have let him see. We both clicked yes, and he was gone in front of me, as if he had never been there. Ignacio disappeared from the fabric of the office in a blink